The first time lightning struck Bhupati's shrine to goddess Lakshmi, it set her face on fire. The makeshift shrine was little more than the foot-high figurine of the goddess balanced in the crumbling bird bath Manisha had found when they moved in, overturned and filled with spiders in the patchy grass behind the rented semi. Bhupati had righted it and hosed it off, envisioning Lakshmi Ma floating serenely on cool, clear water, surrounded by offerings of flowers and fresh fruit. But when he filled it up and placed her in, she had capsized immediately, chipping half a lotus from her third hand. He had propped her up with some loose rocks, still hopeful she could be happy even in such a cold and brittle place as this. But soon the raccoons started arriving nightly to eat the fruit, shit in the yard, and tip over the garbage cans. And when the water froze in November, Bhupati abandoned Lakshmi to the elements. It was spring when the lightning struck. Bhupati was watching the storm through the sliding back doors, the rain coming down in unrelenting sheets. He could see Lakshmi out there, the red of her painted sari, the only bright spot in the drenched April dusk. Manisha was working the night shift at the hospital, leaving him to find his own dinner, which he ate standing, his fingers greasy with each fat, flaky samosa he pulled from the paper bag. It had been raining for days, alternating between freezing drizzle, brief, angry downpours, and a kind of mist with teeth. This storm, though, this was the worst he had seen. On the other side of the chain-link fence separating Bhupati's yard from the Haitian family's yard, their dog made nervous circles under the overhang of the roof, barking at the electricity in the air. Maybe it was a warning. Bhupati heard the crack before he saw the flash, and behind him, the power went out in the kitchen. It went out all over Parkdale, but he didn't know that yet. All he knew for certain was that Lakshmi was burning. His first thought was to run out and save her in what would have been an uncharacteristic act of bravery. His hand went to the door handle and he pulled, but the onslaught of weather assailed him so violently, or so he felt, that he quickly slid the door closed again. He watched the fire in the bird bath burning in the rain. Why didn't the rain put the fire out? Why did only Lakshmi's pink moon face burn while the rest of her dripped water untouched by flame? It was a mystery. No, it was a miracle. As soon as this realization occurred to him, Bhupati felt a bubbling excitement and exhilaration flowing lava-like through his body, spilling out of his sandpaper heel so that he could not stand still. What to do? Pacing and turning and shifting from foot to foot. What to do? Capture it. Bhupati spun around in his slippered feet and realized then that all the lights in the house had gone out. The lights are off, but somebody is home. He chuckled to himself at his own joke, squinting as he reached for his jacket, tossed over the back of his chair, tucked in across from Manisha's chair at the kitchen table. He pulled his phone from a side pocket and held it up to the glass. With his eyes, he could see the fire clearly, but through the phone camera's lens, through the dirt-streaked, rain-spattered door, through the gusting and the pouring and the distance and the dark, there was nothing. Bloody, useless Bhupati muttered, jabbing at buttons on the phone, opening and closing his thumb and forefinger on the screen in a futile attempt to zoom in. After several minutes of this, the battery icon began to flash red. The phone went dead, and the fire went out. Bhupati took the streetcar to Little India and bought another Lakshmi. At the Walmart in Gerrard Square, he found an inflatable pool for children, a bicycle pump to inflate it, and in the toy section, a box of wooden fruit. He brought all these things home, and when the backyard dried out, he set up a new shrine. Manisha watched from the kitchen, unimpressed. Bhupati thought he saw her mouth moving, but through the door, her face was a blur. He put his hand to his ear and shook his head. "Since when do you pray?" she demanded, sliding the door open and standing with hands on rounded hips. "What's the point of all this?" Pregnancy made her irritable. It was true Bhupati had no real intention of praying to the goddess, but he believed somehow that giving her a home, caring for her, feeding her, these acts would be devotion enough to get them to the hills. Bhupati waved Manisha back inside and returned to his work. It seemed wrong somehow to dump the first Lakshmi in the trash, so Buddy decided to keep her, charred face and all. He placed Lakshmi number 1 in the pool facing the neighbor's house, and in front of her he placed Lakshmi number 2, facing straight ahead and smiling, the gold coins glued to the palm of her second hand, glinting in the sunlight. He put the fruit and the vegetables he discovered on a metal thali and left them floating for the goddesses to enjoy. Sometimes during the summer, he would bring flowers from Queen's Supermarket, rip them from their stems, and add them to the pool, stirring with his feet a goddess soup in an inflatable bowl. The second time lightning struck Bhupati's shrine to goddess Lakshmi, it set her hands on fire, all 8 of them. The backyard had been blanketed in snow since January, and by April, Bhupati had all but forgotten about the Lakshmis, buried up to their crowns, sleeping in the ice. Or maybe they were awake and waiting. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. When I read that, it was so because it's the first story in the collection,
Yeah.
and it was so interesting, just the meaning behind the shrine and the relationship. Can you maybe tell us a bit about like why you chose this to read first for us today, and maybe even why kind of like you chose it to be the first story in your collection?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite stories in the collection. And it's one of the only ones I think people point out. I can always tell who hasn't read the whole story because they'll say, "Oh, it's so funny. This is the only one with a male main character." And I kind of go, "Is he the main character? Is he the one in control in this story? Why don't you read to the end to find out?" There's a bit of a twist at the end that I think sort of speaks to the rest of the collection, which is really kind of about women and girls taking control, taking power back, and in these kind of moments of transformation. So it's a good setup to the rest of the book, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I really hope I'm not like spoiling this for anybody else. But when you said take control, that kind of reminded me of the two sisters story, Bravika and Devika, and wow, the ending, it just like, um, it was really interesting. And anyways, before I get like start gushing about the various stories, if anybody has any questions, you can put them in the chat, and we'd love to hear from you if you have questions about the collection or writing in general. Of course, we're more than welcome to put ask Anuja. Um, so the first question I have here is the dedication at the beginning of your book reads, this book is for all of the girls and women that don't see themselves in most stories. You are worthy of reflection despite what you have been told. Can you tell us more about why you started the book with this profound reflection? And were the themes of identity and representation in your writing intentional?
Yeah, yeah, they were super intentional. I think just for me, like I've always been an avid reader. I read a lot of like fantasy and horror, but if you think about kind of what the sort of popular books, when you were growing up, when I was growing up, popular media, things on TV, like very, very few uh brown people as main characters, and especially brown women. And when you did see them, they were so often these like very stereotypical characters, right? We get to be the best friend, we get to be victims and virgins and sidekicks and things like that. So it was really, and for me, even when I first started writing, I really wrote all kind of straight white characters, not not really thinking about it, but just because that's what I had seen and that's what I had read for my whole life. So it was really this kind of intentional switch I had to make where I kind of went, why am I doing this? Who am I writing this for? And if I want to see people that look like me in stories, then I'm going to start by writing them. So it was very intentional. I think when I talk about reflection, I kind of mean it in two different ways. So certainly you are worthy of reflection, as in you are worthy of being seen, you are worthy of being heard, you are worthy of being in every kind of story. But also reflection as in when you reflect on something, uh, you're really thinking about it. You're giving it your full attention. It is interesting. You're invested in that. And again, especially brown characters, brown women, queer brown characters don't get that kind of reflection. We don't get that kind of attention, that kind of main character energy. So that's also what I mean by you are worthy of main character energy.
Yeah, I think that's really it's so reflective in your collection because you just have so many different types of women, and it's very cool because sometimes you see yourself in that, and you see others in your circle in them. So that was really cool. It's really interesting. Um, the stories in your collection are riveting, like as I mentioned. Have you thought about ever expanding the short stories into full-fledged novels?
I have a lot of people have messaged me on like social media to be like, at the end of this story, what happens? I'm like, I don't know, the story's over. Like, I didn't think about it beyond that. But so there's been a couple of them where other people have certainly said, please keep this going, please turn this into a novel. I think for me, if I was going to expand one, and I've sort of started outlining what could be a novel of the Vitalis song, which is the second story I think in this collection. It's kind of half ghost story, half queer love story, and it's one that I really love. It seems to have touched a lot of people. I've gotten a lot of messages about it, and I think there is more story to be told there. So if I was going to expand one into a novel, that would be it, I think.
Yeah, I would I'd definitely love to read more of that because I just felt it was way too short. Um, so we have quite a few questions here.
Okay.
So I'm really excited to get through them. So our first one's actually a comment. Your writing style is very lively, keeping a reader engaged from the start and throughout.
Oh, thank you.
The other question we have is, in which time period does the event happen? Not sure if there's a specific event. This is from Anne Verghese. Um, but is there like, would you like to talk about, is there a specific time period that the stories take place?
Um, I think they take place in a bunch of different time periods. So the Vitala song kind of goes between the 80s. If anyone's a Bollywood fan, it revolves around these two girls who become kind of infatuated with Hema Malini. So it's sort of goes between the 80s and more, I guess, like in the future of that. There's some that take place in the 90s, some that take place more present day. So it's kind of all over the map in terms of time period.
Okay. Did you always know you wanted to write? What was that like? What inspires you, and how do the stories start to flow?
Oh wow. That's like three different questions. Um, okay, did you always know you wanted to write? Yes, I think I was always like kind of scribbling something down, but as maybe others can relate to, my parents were not like particularly enthusiastic about a creative career. So it was, certainly like, oh, write as a hobby, but also like get a real job, please. So I wasn't really ever thinking about it as a career, and it really, and I still have a full-time job. I work in the nonprofit sector, but it kind of took pre-pandemic. I lost a job that I had. I was at kind of a national healthcare charity. And I lost that job very suddenly. And in that moment of like, oh, what am I going to do now? It was, I had this aha moment of like, I'm going to write. And I don't know if anything is going to come from it. I don't know if I'll write anything good or if it will get published or anyone will read it. But I made that decision to really give it a try, to start doing it more intentionally, to start investing in it a little bit. That's when I enrolled in the creative writing course at U of T, and it just kind of all went from there. So I think I don't know if that answers the question, but I did know, but it took kind of an unexpected and kind of crappy thing to push me in this direction. And then what was the rest of the question?
Um, what was that like? What inspires you, and how did the stories start to flow?
What inspires me? So again, I read a lot. I'm usually reading 2 or 3 books at once. I read a lot of like literary fiction, certainly. I also read nonfiction. I read a lot of short stories, sometimes poetry, although not as much, and just a lot of fantasy and horror, romance. So a lot of genre fiction. And I think that inspires me. I think sometimes we have this thing as writers, when you read something that's really good, you kind of go, ah, how could I, why would I ever write after this? I could never write anything like that. And that's true. You can never write anything like that, but you can write your own stories. You really can. And I think when I read things like that are so beautiful, it really inspires me to sit back down at my own desk, or out at a coffee shop sometimes, to try and get my own stories out. I think that's really inspiring. I also just try and like uh be out in the world. I think so much of if you read these stories, so much of it is comes from like real world experiences. So a lot of even the things that feel kind of uncomfortable, or uh don't feel like they're inspiring in the moment. If you give it some time and space, they'll come back in ways that can be inspiring in terms of turning it into a good story on the page.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Um, so we have just trying to scroll. Okay, so this is a big one. This is about Angie F. I love this short story collection. I usually don't read horror and speculative work, but I flew through this. I enjoyed the representation and varied themes. Definitely a five-star collection for me.
Oh, thank
Do you
you.
have any other work that will be published soon? Some of these stories still live in my head rent-free months after I read them.
Thank you. It's so nice. It's so nice when I hear things like that. For a long time, before this book was published, some of these stories were published earlier in like literary magazines, and you just have no idea because they're out on the internet. You just have no idea sometimes if anybody has read them. So it's very nice to get feedback, to hear that people are reading the stories, and they're resonating. Um, what was the rest of the question? Do I have other work
Yes.
currently or coming out, or?
Yes. So do you have oh my gosh, I'm sorry, my mouse is like disappeared. Um, do you have any other work that will be published soon? So are you working on anything right now that will be out soon?
Yes. So it's a bit of a departure, I think, from uh literary short stories, but I will have, and you guys are getting kind of an early notice of this because it hasn't been announced publicly, but I will have kind of a series of medieval India inspired fantasy coming out, not in the next year or so.
Nice. And is it also going to be a short story collection?
No,
Okay.
these are
Okay.
these are big fantasy novels.
Awesome. Yes, we want more. We are greedy like that. I'm
Yep.
sorry. All right, so we do have one more question. Writing short stories can be very challenging. Can you speak to your process? I.e., do you start with the scene, idea for a story, or a first line?
Yeah. For me, I think stories always start with some kind of like sensory detail. So it's like either like the way someone's voice sounds, the way a certain place feels, the way something smells. Um, with Bupati, that came from kind of walking around Parkdale. If anyone knows Parkdale in Toronto, and just some of those old houses, I'm like, I bet there's in someone's backyard there's an overturned fountain full of spiders that could be, so a lot of, if you I lived in Toronto for 10 years, so there's a lot of very real kind of place-based memory in this collection. And a lot of the things in the stories are based on like things and people that actually happened and exist. So it comes from these kind of real sensory things and then sort of builds from there. I also usually know where a story is going to end. Very quickly, I have that, whatever that last image is, or whatever that last feeling that I want people to have. I usually have that very quickly, and then it's more a question of how do we get there?
Okay. Awesome. If anybody has any more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. So I have a few more questions of my own. Um, so I guess you kind of covered some of these questions, maybe. But what made you choose to write short stories as opposed to other types of works?
Yeah, I love short stories. I am the fiction editor at the Ex Puritan magazine. It's a literary magazine. So I read a lot of short stories. I spend a lot of time thinking about short stories and editing short stories. So I love the form in general, but also in terms of writing, it felt like the most sort of practical, doable thing for me, right? I have a full-time job. I have two children. Like I try and see my friends and family. And the idea at that time, kind of when I made that decision of like, I'm gonna try and write, what felt practical and doable to me was to try and write short stories. I didn't have the brain space in that moment to tackle a novel, but I felt like I can I can figure out, 5,000 words on this one character, on this one
Mhm.
slice of life, and I can make that feel real, and I can tell a story there. So I think for me, that's where it came from, and it was also just trying it, right? It wasn't. I didn't know what would come out of it. So it was trying things, sending things out into the world. It also took me a little while to just allow myself. I when I first started sending things out, I think I had I don't know, maybe a preconception about what people wanted to read or what I should try and write, what's going to appeal to the most people. Um, and I had some lovely readers and friends that read it and went, "This doesn't sound like you." Like, so I had to kind of give myself permission to just write the weird stuff and the ghost stories and kind of the messy relationships and things like that, the things that my mom doesn't want me to write about. And I think once I gave myself permission to just write like what was actually me and what felt true and fun for me, that's where they came from, and that's how short stories became the thing.
Awesome. So I guess like kind of going back to just balancing your life. So we have a participant asking, how do you balance full-time work with your writing practice? So it's not just full-time work, you're a full-time mom, full-time job, and like a full-time light writer. So yeah, how do you do it?
I don't know. I don't know. I kind of think balance is a myth. Like no one, I don't know. I don't know that anybody has it figured out unless you have a
Mhm.
lot of money and a lot of help in your life. I am very privileged, I think, to, have a job and have a supportive partner and family and friends around who help and who make, things like taking a writing weekend possible. Sometimes I will go and hole up in a hotel room or like an Airbnb for a weekend, just away from my family and my laundry and everything, just to write, just to revise, to really be like immersed in the world or in the story that I'm trying to finish. Um, but yeah, it's really tough. I think I've had to again just give myself permission to do what works. I've heard
Mhm.
so many different like kinds of advice for like the right way to write, right? Some people are like, "Oh, you have to write every day or you have to like set a word count and you have to get to that word count no matter what." Like none of that is going to work for me. Just being realistic about my life and what works for me.
Mhm.
Um and just allowing myself that kind of flexibility and freedom to write when it makes sense. Also just I don't, some people will say like write through the blocks when you're blocked, but I feel like for me, I have to write where the energy is, right? So if
Hmm.
I'm trying to do something and it's not working, I don't force that to work. I try and do something else, right? I usually have 2 or 3 different writing projects on the go. Usually one of them will be like something fun or something silly. It'll be like a fanfic, or it'll be like something I'm writing, as a collaborative thing with a friend, or it'll be, a piece that I'm editing with somebody else. So I'll try and switch to different things. And I find that whatever you're actually working on, your main sort of project, it never goes away. It's always like percolating in your head. So even if you leave it for a day or a week or a month or whatever to go do other things, be out in the world, consume other art, spend time with people who like make you laugh and inspire you, whenever you come back to your writing, you bring all of that with you. So you may come back to it with fresh eyes and maybe a fresh pen. I don't know.
Okay, cool. Thank you. We have another question. Who are some of your favorite authors?
Oh, that's a good question. So I mean, you can see a lot of the influences, I think, in Chrysalis. So Jhumpa Lahiri, Ursula K. Le Guin, uh, Anna Rice, probably when I was like too young to be reading Anna Rice. I started that with that. Alice Munro, obviously, she just passed away, so I've been reading some of her short stories, which are so brilliant. Arundhati Roy. Who else? So if I'm thinking about like more genre work, if anyone is a fantasy fan, I've been reading Tasha Suri's. Uh, it's a trilogy that she's working towards. Just beautiful, like Indian inspired fantasy. Shashi Bhatt has a great new short story collection out called Death by a Thousand Cuts. I love all her work as well. So I could talk about other people's work for a long time.
Awesome. Thank you. Um, so I'll go back to my questions. Well, if you have any more questions, folks, please drop them in the chat. Um, how important do you think a short story is, and how did you choose the titles for your stories?
How important do I like to me or just like in the world?
Just generally, like, I find that not a lot of people read short stories. And so
Yeah.
what, like, in terms of like why you chose to write short stories, just for your writing style and like what your preference, but generally speaking, like, do you think like short stories are like, how would you sell it, I guess?
Um, I don't know who like said this, so I'll paraphrase it, but there's a great quote about short stories that's like, um, reading a novel is like living in the house, and reading a short story is like peeking in the window. And I kind of love that idea that you don't have to live in a house. You can just take this like very brief glimpse into someone's life, and just at a very particular moment. And I think the best short stories are able to do that, are able to really frame something very specific that's happening in someone's life, in someone's family, in someone's relationship. Um, and like just show you kind of a new way of looking at that, a new view that you didn't have before. So yeah, I think a short story can do a lot. And I've heard a lot of people say to me, oh, I never read short story collections, but I'm gonna give yours a try. And I say, great, like let this be your gateway into short stories, because they can be really powerful, and it's also just like a lower commitment of reading. I think a lot of people, especially kind of during the pandemic and coming out of it, I heard from a lot of people like, I just don't have the brain space to get into like a whole novel right now. And so many people are like, I don't know, I don't really read, or these kind of things. And if for so many of us that don't have a ton of free time in our lives to like dedicate to a giant novel. I think short stories are a great way to keep reading, to keep sort of enriching your life with good stories, but in these kind of bite-sized ways that are manageable for a lot of people.
Yeah. I that window picking, I that reminded me of one of your stories that's in this collection, the Talia and Sunil story, and there's just so much more to it, but like you just see this like little slice of their life and this instant where like things are gonna change so drastically in both their lives, in all of their lives that they're involved in, and it's so that's so right, and it's just sometimes it wants you create your own stories, your backstories after that, right?
So many people have messaged me about that story in particular to be like, but what happens? Like you can't just leave it like this. I'm like, but I
Yeah.
did just leave it like that. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I guess the second part of that question was like, how did you choose the titles for your story?
Oh,
Some of
that's
them
a good
were
question.
like, yeah.
What are the titles? Um, the titles I always come up with last. They're saved as like, story about Chitra for, like on my desktop until I come to the end of it. And then I don't know, some of them come quickly and then some I'll like rework a couple times and then you may title it one thing and then you're not super thrilled with that. So you come up with other things. A lot of the time I've had just very good like other readers, right? Other friends and first readers and good editors who have read it and said like, what about this? And I go, yes, you're right. You see it more clearly than I do. That makes sense. Chrysalis itself, because that is the title of a story in the collection as well as the title of the book, but that was not the original title of that story. It was first published in a literary magazine, and the editor of the story for that magazine was the one who said, this story is actually about this woman kind of transforming in different ways. What about, and it's sort of, there's a bit of that chrysalis metaphor throughout the story. He said, what about just calling it Chrysalis? And it was like, oh, of course, of course. So sometimes you do need somebody outside of the story. When you've been working on a story for so long, it's hard to see it clearly from the outside. And you do sometimes need that outside lens to say, what about this?
Okay, so we do have a question from our participants here, attendees. How do you keep the thread of a story as you go about living your life, doing tons of other things every day?
How do you keep the thread of a story? Well, you know what? For me, that's one of the ways I know when a story is working is when because if it's not working, if there's parts of it that are kind of fraying in your mind, if you're losing that thread, it's floating away, that's sometimes a good indication to me that like this isn't working, or I need to go back to it, or I need to scrap it altogether, or I need to take whatever that one kernel is that started it and put it into something else. Like there's a different story that needs this idea than what I started on. So when that thread starts to fray and disappear, that's actually a good indication to me that I need to kind of switch tracks on that. Usually when a story is working for me, the thread is pretty strong and it wants to continue being weaved. So I think like even if I do end up putting it aside for life or for other reasons, when I come back to it, sort of as I said, I sometimes bring some of those other life things, other art things back to it, which might influence it in different ways. But usually it's there, right? That story wants to be told, and I don't think it doesn't usually disappear.
Okay. Um, did you write for children, or would you like to do so?
Oh no. No, I actually I love kids books and I have so much respect for kids, for like kidlit writers. I think kids are actually very harsh critics. They will tell you straight up if your story sucks.
Hmm.
But yeah, I don't think I would necessarily be a very good kidlit writer.
It's a lot harder than people think to write for
So much
children, and
harder.
like
Yes.
trying to write a picture book. I remember trying to do that for one of my courses, and I was like, yeah, I don't know how they do it. They're just really talented. Yeah.
It's magic. It's absolutely magic.
Yeah. We have another question here. I really enjoyed your stories. They are strong and have remained with me. You mentioned these stories have been previously published in literary journals. What was the submission experience like? How have you been published outside of Canada?
Oh, what was the submission experience like? Probably like most writers, submitting stories to magazines, lots of rejections, lots of no's, lots of waiting. Sometimes you send things to literary magazines and you don't hear back for months and months. So, now kind of being on the other side of it, I always tell people, like, don't, when you send something out, send it out and forget about it. Like, send it out and write something else. Send it out and do other things, because it's not worth waiting around for months and months, maybe just to hear a no. You really never know. So there was a lot of that, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of just like, well, I hope somebody likes this. But then as you start to get some of those yeses, as you start to build relationships with editors and with magazines, those were really the building blocks for me towards publishing an entire collection in a book form. So you know a bit of a mixed bag in terms of a submission experience, which I think is true probably for many writers. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Have you been published outside of Canada?
I don't think so. I mean, technically, Chrysalis is available outside of Canada. So, like in American bookstores, with like it's mostly in North America. I don't think it's being distributed outside of North America. Um, I have stories in a couple different anthologies, so in a couple different horror anthologies, and like women's erotica anthologies that are published outside of Canada as well. But no, this is my first book, and I think it's primarily sort of in Canada where it's being distributed.
Would you ever think about either for translations or even like being published in South Asia? Because I feel like a lot of these stories would resonate so much
Go.
with South Asian women.
Yeah.
Speaking for myself at least. But yeah, have you ever like has that something has crossed your mind or come across your table?
For sure. I mean, I would obviously love that to be the case. It is actually getting a French translation, so that will
Oh.
yeah, I just actually found that out like yesterday. So yeah, it will come out in French with a Quebec-based publisher. Um but yeah, in terms of like other translations or coming out in other markets, it would really it would need like an editor at some other press. So Chrysalis is published with House of Anansi, which is kind of an independent Canadian publisher, but would really need to be an editor at a publisher overseas who picks it up somehow, or somebody throws it across their desk and goes, you know what, we want to buy the rights to this book. So if anybody knows any international editors, that would be a very cool experience for sure.
Awesome. Okay, so we have a few questions here. Have you ever thought about having new type of book that contains comic pictures and cartoons? So I guess like a comic book
Like a
kind of
graphic
collection?
novel.
Yeah.
Well, I have no artistic ability whatsoever. Um, so no, it would be like a comic book of stick figures, which I don't know that anybody really wants to read. Um, So no, I don't know that that is in my wheelhouse per se. I would love if there was like an opportunity to collaborate with an illustrator or a graphic artist, where somebody else was in charge of doing the pictures and I was more working on the text. I would love that type of collaboration, maybe.
Yeah, I think that would be really cool. I know a lot of writers do collaborate with artists, and it's really cool when two really great writer and artists come together. They create such beautiful work. So we'll
Yeah.
keep an eye out for that. The next question is, do you think it would your book will be translated into Arabic? And do you read or do you or have you read any Arabic stories translated into English?
Oh, I would obviously love for it to be translated into Arabic. Again, I think I would need an editor who was interested in doing that. I don't know if I've read any translations from the Arabic, but well, certainly if there's any recommendations that I should check out, I would be interested in that. I did actually just recently do a Q&A with Kalpana Reina, who did a translation of it's her uncle's work, and I think the book is called For Now It Is Night. But they're short stories that were originally published in Kashmiri, and so it's really cool to talk to someone who has done a translation and like what that experience is like versus being the writer versus the translator. And how do you capture like the tone? There's so much more than just putting something into Google Translate and what you get back, right? So it's cool to think about what works in translation could be.
Yeah, yeah. Um, all right, so we have another question here. How do you approach creating and embodying characters, especially so many of them?
That's a good question. Um, well, I think for these stories in particular, so many of them were based on either my own experiences or my friends or my family or my coworkers or my crappy bosses, the hotel managers that were mean to me when I was planning my wedding. So there's a lot of like real life experiences and people in this book. Very hilariously, my not so great boss that is modeled in one of these stories reached out to me to be like, congratulations. I'm like, oh sir, you haven't read this book, have you? But I mean, there's a kernel of truth in a lot of the characters, um, where a lot of them started, and then I think, especially for the stories that are a bit more speculative, I had that because I have usually have that idea of where it's going to end. Um, as I'm working backwards, that's how that character kind of develops. I find kind of their voice, I find their backstory, I find like what is the thing they want the most? What is the thing that enrages them? So these little like character bits and pieces that start to come together to hopefully make them feel like real people that you could run into. Oh, you are muted for me. I cannot hear you. I don't know if people can hear me.
Okay, sorry. I think I pressed something and
There you
something
go.
happened. Anyways, we have one more question here. Do you ever worry about family or people that you know reading your work? Asking as a South Asian, LOL.
Yeah, no, for sure. I did have a little bit of that worry. And like, so like my mom's not a huge reader, but she skimmed this collection and her first reaction was like, why did you write this? Like basically, if you were going to write about Indian people and Indian brown women, why didn't you tell nicer stories? Like, why didn't you tell about triumphant immigrants and, all the good things that we do in Canada. Like, why did you tell about failing marriages and like messy relationships and these kind of weird horror stories where families like kill each other? And I went, I don't know. I mean, our stories aren't always nice, right? My experiences haven't always been nice. Uh, and like we as brown women don't always have to be nice, and we're still worthy of being heard and seen. Uh, so I kind of had to like reconcile that if I'm going to tell stories that feel true to me, that feel meaningful and are grounded in like experiences and people that I want to see reflected, that are worthy of being reflected, that's going to make some people uncomfortable, and I had to be okay with that. On the flip side of that, I also kind of knew that by putting these stories out there in the world, they're going to mean a lot to the people who need to read them or who will find them. So for me, that's kind of the payoff. Like, that yes, it's not going to be for everybody. It's going to make some people uncomfortable. You're going to get some auntie saying, why did you write this? But like on the flip side, somebody's going to pick up that book and be like, somebody did write to me and be like, this story that you wrote, like, that is me, that is my story. And I'm like, no, girl, that's my story. But like, I'm glad that, we're on the same page here.
Yeah. Agreed for all of that. Because I think like while I was reading some of them, although I don't see myself in that, but I know that there's somebody out there that sees himself in that. And that was like, I think that's very important. Sometimes we forget the marginalized. Um, all right, so another question here. I write poems and they're so personal. I'm nervous about sharing my work and having others read it, especially family and friends. I guess this is more of a comment. And I guess like maybe you've already kind of touched upon this. Is there something that like as a budding writer or somebody who wants to publish these works, like how to prepare yourself to be able to deal with I guess, the pushback from your own community,
Yeah.
especially with your own family. I think rather than outside community, sometimes it's just even your own family that pushes back, right?
Yeah, for sure. I don't know. I always say, as a writer, whatever you're writing, you kind of need two camps of people. So you need the people who are your cheerleaders, and that may or may not be your family. In many cases, it's not. But these are like your friends, the people in your life who are going to read everything you write and be like, "Oh my God, that is the best thing!" Like, that's incredible. Send it to the New Yorker. You know what I mean? Like, they're going to be your cheerleaders no matter what. And you need that because you're gonna get pushback from your family or your cultural community, and you're gonna get rejections from literary magazines and things like that. So we really, as writers, need people in our life who are gonna be like, you're amazing. It doesn't matter what anyone says. It doesn't matter if your mom said it wasn't good. It doesn't matter if this editor at a literary magazine said it wasn't good. You're good. You're good. So you need that camp of people. You also need readers. Like, so, and these are like your fellow writers. These are people who are also working, hopefully working towards the same kind of goals that you are, whether that's in your case publishing poetry, maybe it's working on a short story collection, maybe it's working on a novel, maybe you're working in the same type of genre. So these are the people who are going to give you that kind of constructive criticism, because often the criticism that we get from our families or our communities is not helpful to us. It's not going to help your writing grow, right? And that is the kind of sort of constructive feedback on your work that's going to help you keep pushing forward, and hopefully achieve those goals. And I think we as writers need both of those groups to be successful.
Yeah. I guess we'll have one more question. Are there any while you put this short story collection together, were there any themes or stories that you had to take out or didn't want to include in this collection?
Yeah, I mean, they're not necessarily that I didn't want to include, but I think when I submitted the manuscript to House Financy, it was then kind of a process of me and my editor looking at that list and saying we made this kind of intentional decision to be like, okay, this is a genre blending collection, so we're going to put in some that are more straightforward literary fiction, we're going to put in some that are more speculative fiction. So it was really about trying to find a balance between those two things. We didn't want it to feel like this is a speculative collection with one random straight lit fic thrown in, or the other way around. We didn't, these are all literary fiction, and then we have this one weird ghost story. Like, that doesn't make sense either. So really trying to find a balance between those two elements. Also really trying to balance kind of length. So some stories in this are a little longer. Some stories are really just flash fiction, almost like just a couple pages long. So we wanted that kind of experience for the reader to have varying lengths and a balance between the speculative elements and more realism. So yeah, I think there were stories that I would have loved to see in the collection, but they were just like, I don't have another 8,000 words to throw in here, so we're gonna take that one out, or this one doesn't really fit. We already have too many speculative ones, so that's kind of how it got shaped.
Okay. So we have one last question from our attendees. I think you have to be very brave to write stories that can also upset some people. Where do you get the courage to write anyway?
Oh man, I don't know. I think we're all brave, right? We're all brave in our own ways, whether or not if you're creating anything, and whether or not you're putting it out there in the world, or even if you're just getting it down on paper, if you're expressing it through any kind of art, if you're sharing it with a friend or with someone on the internet, if you don't have someone in your immediate community that you can share the things that feel true and important to you with, that's all brave. Any kind of creating is an act of bravery, I think. um I don't know. I feel the most like me, I think, when I'm writing. That feels like my what I can do, how I want to tell stories in the world. And I think there's lots of different ways to tell stories in the world. So I don't know. I don't know if I'm brave or not, but I do feel like I'm doing the thing that I'm maybe supposed to be doing in the world.
Yeah. And I think we can all say thank you for doing that, and we really appreciate that, and to be seen
Yeah.
in your stories. So it comes to our conclusion.
Oh,
We're hitting that 7:59 mark. One more
it goes so
minute.
fast.
I know, and I wish we can talk for longer, but I don't want to take over anyone else's evening. Thank you, Anuja, so much for this conversation, for your work. We hope to see you again when you publish your next work. We're excited for that. And everyone who's here today, thank you so much for coming here. It's really great to have you here this evening. Remember that our next one is actually going to be a hybrid. So it will be in person at Hazel McCallion Central Library, um, on the second floor. And it's on June 26th, 7 to 8 p.m. And we have Adriana Chartrand, who will be speaking about their work, and ordinary violence. And please, yeah, join us. You can register online. And if you have any feedback for this program, we would love to hear from you. Your feedback helps us improve our programming, and get more programs to get involved in. So thank you for that. And you can connect with us on all of our socials, as well as in person. Come see us. Come see the new building, and all of our lovely librarians and staff here. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Hope you have a great night, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.